Good morning, everyone, and welcome to DrayTek's Q&A session for DrayTek Security Best Practices for Router Configuration. Thank you very much for your interest from our recent webinar on security. Due to that, we've had a high intake of questions, so today is to get started on answering a lot of those and also taking your questions from today. I would first like to start off introducing who will be leading our presentation today. So you'll have Alex Shuker, Head of Technical Services and Product, and also Doris Vincent, our Solution Architect. And there'll also be several other technical team members that will be supporting today as well.
Thank you. Hey, good morning, everybody. Yes, so the agenda we've got today is we're focusing on a lot of the questions we had during the previous presentation, which is around router best practices and security. So to follow up on that, what we're doing is briefly a practices framework checklist that follows up on some of the stuff that we presented last time, and then we'll go and cover some of the common questions that we've already had that were asked during the presentation previously, but also follow up by people who contacted us. And then afterwards, we'll go for a live Q&A. For the live Q&A, we will take any of the questions you ask now during the initial bit of presentation. So if you've got any questions, just type them into the chat and we will be able to answer directly to you as well, but also we'll be going through that during our live Q&A session. So you feel free to ask any questions you want, and then we'll because we've got a lot of time allocated to this, we should hopefully be able to get through all of those questions, but it depends how many questions you all ask. Got a lot of people who've joined, so really interesting to see how this goes. It's a slightly different session for us compared to some of our other webinars, but yeah, it hopefully will be very useful for everyone. So to get started, let's just cover the router security best practices and talk about a checklist that can help you with following that. So the last presentation, we've got a recording of that if anyone didn't catch that and would like to watch it, covered different things to do with router best practices and focusing on the router configuration and different aspects of the configuration, and also different parts of the best practices in a few different areas to do with router administration, network configuration, hardening the configuration, monitoring, and also managing firmware updates and monitoring for attacks and what to do if there's any issues and how to mitigate and recover from an attack. So in those different areas, there's a bunch of different things that you can check through if installing a site to make sure that all the bases are covered. So for this, we've got a few different things. These aren't absolutely everything in that you could do related to all of those, but we've picked, I think, a checklist of some key things related to that, and I'd like to just talk through each section. I know there's a lot just on one page, so what I'll do is I'll go through each section in detail to cover the checklist. So the first thing is to do with securing the router locally. So that's about physical security. So that's something that should be considered when it comes to the installation. Related to that is also whether or not you enable panel controls, because in some cases the router, due to the nature of where it's being installed, may be accessible to staff, and in that case there may be some panel controls that want to be set, because with the panel control you can disable the factory reset or disable the wireless LAN buttons. That can be really handy because sometimes people do try and solve an issue, and occasionally they'll think, oh well, if I press this factory reset button, maybe that's going to solve my problem, and that then can cause more problems. So you can helpfully on the DrayTek routers disable the factory reset button through the panel control, and also you can use the panel control to disable specific LAN interfaces and also the USB ports if you need to. Next thing on the checklist is to make sure that all the defaults are changed. On later firmware now, you're forced to change the admin password, which is a really good step. But also, it's something where with the admin accounts, do consider what following your processes to do with setting up additional admin accounts, and also there with that setting up external authentication or enabling two-factor authentication from the WAN, or maybe the one-time password. So that's the kind of basic checklist for the router administration. The next part is the configuration hardening. With that, there's a few things that should be enabled. So autologger should be enabled. That isn't enabled by default. And also enable the validation code. That validation code prevents some brute force type attacks, because the person has to put in the validation code that appears on screen, like a captcha type of thing, where they have to type in the numbers they see on screen as well as the password. Adding a warning to the login page is really handy. That's a good thing to do. It's also helpful for internal users as well, because sometimes it's good to remind people that they need to log any changes and that sort of thing. So those sort of messages are useful internally for internal communications as well. And also sometimes it can be helpful to put in who's responsible for a site related to that. So that can help if someone has come across a device and not quite sure who is responsible for that or who to go, especially if you've got organizations that have multiple kind of end users that have multiple different organizations that are offering service to them. So then that can help with directing an end user to the right people and the appropriate person or organization that is managing that service for them. Disabling unused VPN services is really important, and disabling also any AP management or device management stuff is a good practice, because the routers can manage APs and switches, but if you're not using that functionality, then it's a good idea to disable that by default. Then we've got disabling ping from the internet, adding an access control list for remote management, and changing the HTTPS management port is also a good idea on the checklist. It doesn't necessarily give you additional security, but it does make it more kind of, you can bypass some scans, even though it's not that difficult to detect what ports and things on. It adds an additional step for someone. And enabling LAN access control for local management is a really good idea, because that prevents from local attacks. If someone has physical access to the unit, or maybe has compromised a device locally on the site, then preventing access from general workstations and rather than dedicated admin machines is helpful, because then that prevents people's route to try and get access to the router. And also disabling old TLS settings. Those are disabled by default, but it's worthwhile just double checking that, especially if it's something that is an older unit that you're checking. The next thing is to do with the configuration. Setting the router DNS is really sensible. By doing that, you'll also able to enable DNS security. So that allows you to get more kind of authentication or verification on the DNS requests, and then also replacing the auto-generated self-signed certificate is a good idea. You can use the DrayTek DDNS service, or you could use a third party. By replacing the self-signed certificate, it can make it less likely for it to appear to be a DrayTek device, because the self-signed one is one that people will potentially recognize and identify as being DrayTek because of the organization that is the root of the self-signed certificate. But if you're replacing that, then that gets a bit more, makes it more obscure. And then setting up WPA 3 for wireless LAN is best practice now instead of WPA 2, and configuring VLANs as well where appropriate. So that's something to make sure that's done. And on the network monitoring, we've got related things to do with being able to monitor what's happening and get auditing logs. So configuring syslog to a USB stick is a really good idea. That if you do enable that, then you've got the logging stored locally, so that can be very helpful. But for remote stuff, enabling remote management with Vigor ACS is really helpful, and that then, if you enable CP notification, gets you getting useful logs that show attempts to log in or when people are logging locally, and also it gives you a timestamp of if people are making changes to the router. So that's really good for auditing purposes. And setting up device config reporting in Vigor ACS is a good idea, so that you can regularly report on the configuration. That this is a function in reports on Vigor ACS, and then enabling DOS defense and spoofing defense and enabling brute force protection are all really helpful network monitoring functions. Then there's ensuring that it's on the latest firmware. This part would you probably do when you first log in before you start changing settings, but it's just in this section on the checklist. And also enabling the automatic firmware recovery. The automatic firmware recovery is really helpful because it means that if the router reboots multiple times, then it can recover for a different firmware version. But it's important to check that the firmware that's it would recover to is the latest version. So you can check to make sure the current firmware is backed up if you've updated. And also take a configuration backup. So this helps with being able to recover the device if there's a hardware failure as much as anything else. And then our last section is on attack mitigation and recovery. So this is primarily around lots of scheduling things to make sure that you're periodically checking everything. So one is to schedule regular configuration backups via Viger ACS. Normally, if someone's making a configuration change, you would expect that they would then also take an updated config if they're doing that manually. But if you're scheduling a regular config backup from Viger ACS, then you do have a copy of all of those, and then that can be very handy if you do need to do any disaster recovery. Documenting the configuration and recovery steps is really important at this point. Those are going to change depending on the site, especially to different ports might be set, different interfaces, and kind of site names and what router and what firmware has been recorded. So that's something that's important to document. And then there's a bunch of scheduling activities that are important. So scheduling a configuration check is really sensible. You can do this manually by inspecting the configuration, but it's also possible to do this sort of configuration check automatically using Viger ACS. The configuration check is helpful because on one way, if anyone has logged in and made a change, an administrator, maybe they've made a change because a client's requested it, but a scheduling configuration can help monitor to make sure that those are still valid and still needed. There can be some things that people maybe enable ports or set up an account for a test or something. By scheduling a regular configuration check, you can pick that up and know spot that. Occasionally people do log into a router and set up something just as a little test. So if someone does that and it doesn't, and they forget to remove it, then a regular configuration check is an additional way of picking up on that and spotting it so that it can be then corrected. Schedule checking of logs to make sure there's no suspicious activity. This also can be done via Viger ACS, but it can be done through examining the syslog. And then also scheduling a router reboot is something that is a more recent recommendation that has been kind of made generally, which isn't specific to DrayTek. It's more to do with cybersecurity and best practices. That there are some attacks which might potentially kind of affect the running configuration, but could be cleared by a reboot of a router. So that's why generally best practice for routers is to have them periodically rebooted, so that if anything was compromised in temporary memory, that would get cleared, because when a router boots, it's loading it from its permanent memory. Then also scheduling a product lifecycle review is important as well, as part of that, to check that it's still a current product, it's still receiving firmware updates. This is all to do with making sure that it's protected from a cybersecurity point of view. So that's kind of a general overview of the check. Sorry, just go back. This is a general overview of the checklist. This is a follow-up to the more detailed overview we gave, running through all of these different parts and more in the previous presentation. So that presentation is online and available for you to watch and stream. So that goes into a lot more detail. But we're also going to be following up with a kind of the checklist and a bit of a white paper that goes into details of all of the different cybersecurity best practices. So that's something that you expect to see from us shortly, which we'll be passing that to everybody. So now let's go on to the main section, which is to cover some common questions. So to begin with, we will cover questions that have been asked beforehand. So Doris is going to come in with me and we'll go through answering those questions.
Thank you, Alex. Hello, everyone. My name is Doris, and I will be co-hosting the Q&A session of today's webinar. So let's take our first question today. Does a DrayTek firewall let any and everything true unless I tell it not to?
Thanks, Doris. Yeah, this is quite a common question that relates to the IP filter rules on the DrayTek and what the defaults are. It also depends on the direction. So there's a slight difference between outbound and inbound traffic. So we first look at outbound. So with outbound traffic, this will depend on the IP filter default rule and any IP filter rules. By default, the standard rule is to be pass, so it would allow all traffic outbound regardless, and then the next part is whether or not someone set up an IP filter rule that then would override that default pass and would block the traffic. So if you haven't set up anything, then you've got a configuration that will allow all outbound traffic to pass. So if you wanted to put more restrictions in, you would have to specifically set up IP filter rules. And then for inbound, it would depend on the whether or not it's solicited or unsolicited. So any unsolicited traffic inbound would be naturally dropped by NAT because there's no corresponding NAT session. But if it's a solicited reply, so let's say that a local client has gone to a website and that website has responded, so that inbound traffic then would be passed because it would match in that session. It would then, however, need to still pass the IP filter rule. So if there are IP filter rules specifically that would be matched that would block inbound traffic, then those IP filter rules would override it. But by default, there aren't rules to block inbound traffic. But most traffic would be unsolicited. All unsolicited traffic would be blocked already because there wouldn't be a corresponding NAT session. So next question.
Next question, if someone knows my router's Wi-Fi password, can they hack the router?
So yeah, if someone does have the Wi-Fi password, that could potentially be problematic if it's not an authorized person, but we can have inside attacks though. One key recommendation is if they have the Wi-Fi password, then that means that they're going to be as if they're on the local network, so they'll be able to access whatever resources locally a device that's plugged in could potentially do, depending on what VLANs they've got in. So one of the first things is related to reusing passwords. So don't ever reuse the same admin password as the Wi-Fi pre-share key, because then if you've got a guest or a visitor to a company and you give them the pre-share key and it happens to be the same as the router admin password, then they could, if they wanted to, then log into the router. So always make sure that's different. If you're having people who are kind of untrusted from that point of view, then it's a really good idea to separate VLAN for guest access. By doing that, you can have a dedicated pre-share key that's just given to guests, which is quite a sensible option, because then you have the ability to more easily restrict local management as well, because you can restrict the router management interfaces locally as well as remotely. So you can make it so that only certain LANs, or you can make it so that only certain IP addresses are able to access the router's management interface. So recommend you would do that, because then that helps if you're allowing someone to log on to the Wi-Fi. Next is another question.
Okay, so the next one is WPA3 mixed mode less secure than WPA3 only?
Okay, so I think people will be familiar with WPA as the security that's used for wireless networks. Started with WPA, then there was WPA2, and now we've got WPA3. On the routers, you can select a WPA3 mixed mode, which means that it supports WPA3 and WPA2. And question there is that as secure as having just WPA3 only? So it's slightly less secure technically. There's a few things that need to be considered. One is WPA3 isn't vulnerable to the crack vulnerability. That's a vulnerability that attacked WPA2 that relates to EAPOL key retries. And although most wireless LAN clients would have already been patched against that a while ago. It does, by using WP3, mean that you're more secure from that, and that prevents there being a possibility that maybe there's some legacy old device that hasn't been updated that's still potentially vulnerable. Because with WPA2, if someone is on the network that's got a vulnerability and they're able to detect that, then they would potentially then be able to get access to the whole of the WPA2 network and be able to snoop on other traffic. Another thing with WP3 is it has protection against offline brute force attacks. So if you're using WP3 only and not using WPA2, it means that people can't snoop on the wireless LAN traffic and then take that away and try and brute force the password, because WPA3 uses SAE, which is simultaneous authentication of equals, which is a more sophisticated way of having a key compared to the WPA2 pre-shared key, which means that the session key, the PMK, the pairwise master key, that is unique for each user. So that means that if someone it is on the network, they can't take. So if someone's able to listen in on the network, they can't take that traffic, go away, and then work out what the pre-shared key is. They'd only actually, if they were able to brute force that individual session for that bit of traffic, they wouldn't be able to then come back and connect to the network. So that's better from a brute force protection. So that means that there's less stress on the strength of the pre-shared key password. I mean, you should always use complicated passwords, but you can use slightly less complicated passwords and still have protection against brute force attack if you compare WPA3 to WPA2. And another advantage with WPA3 is the OWE, which is opportunistic wireless encryption, which is where you don't have authentication. So an open network previously doesn't have any encryption, but with WPA3, an open network where you're connecting without a password that you're using for guest access is still encrypted. So that means that all the guests who are connecting are able to be secured from each other, and also no one can snoop on that traffic. So WPA3 is a much better way of doing it if you've got clients that do support WPA3, so you have the ability to enable WPA3 only. So if you do have WPA2 only clients, you could set multiple SSIDs to have a WPA3 network, so maybe for the main corporate domain, and then use WPA2 for others, or if there's maybe more legacy devices, and then do some routing between.
Okay, so the next question is there a way to set up a config to keep details if factory reset?
Yeah, so it's I think a common concern for MSPs relating to devices that have been deployed to site, because if they get a factory reset, then potentially that means there's got to be a site visit. So one option is to disable the factory reset button. That's a really good kind of low-tech way of controlling that. But it is also potentially possible to have a custom config where the router's factory default settings have some default settings in them that maybe are specific to the connection and to the deployment, that allows, if someone's factory reset, for the unit to then maybe go back online, go into Vigor ACS, and then potentially be redeployed automatically, which can help save a site visit. With that, discuss those with your supplier if you've got something where you're interested in that, because there's different suppliers who can offer that sort of custom config service. It's not something you can do case by case on individual units, but it's something that people with the right tooling are able to offer that sort of service. So I'd recommend discussing that with your supplier, and that they should be able to help you out.
Okay, thank you. Move on to the next question. Is it possible to apply access control list to just one service? Example, apply access list to tier 069, but not to HTTPS.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, the access control list is really helpful because it allows you to put in either domain names or IP addresses to restrict access to services to only matching those IPs or domain names. Unfortunately, it will only apply to all interfaces. So the ACL is universal. So if you enable the ACL, that will apply to all router management interfaces. So you don't have the ability to pick and choose. I'm afraid that's just how it is.
Okay. Another question. What is the maximum admin password length and what characters are supported?
It's a slightly tricky question because it depends on the model, in some cases the firmware and the type of device as well. So on most models, if there's a list of restricted characters, it will be listed in the menu. So if there's maybe specific characters that aren't supported, then it will normally mention that in the menu where you're setting the password. On the kind of 2865, 2927 series, when it comes to password length, it's 83 characters, and it supports numbers, uppercase, lowercase, and the standard ASCII symbols. What I mean by that is not the extended, so kind of letters with funny things on top, omelets and things like those you can't use, but you can generally, I think, use any symbol that you can see on a keyboard should be valid. But the extended keys, the ones that you need to press an alt and a few numbers to do, aren't supported as passwords on those models.
Okay, another question is, why isn't the feature enabled or disabled by default?
Okay, so yeah, that's relating to some of our recommendations. There's some things that we're recommending people enable, for example, the verification code, and those aren't enabled by default, but we're kind of suggesting that you do enable those, and there are some services that are enabled that we're recommending disabling. It's something that we are kind of reviewing and looking at, making some changes to factory default settings and evaluating what the impact of those would be, because we do recognize that there are some things where we're getting people to kind of recommending them to do it every single time, and so that's something that's being reviewed. So there may be some changes with some of those, if that hopefully answers that question that someone's put in.
Okay, are there any classroom-based courses? That's another question.
Yeah, we've for a while now been doing our online courses, which are remote-based ones, but we are in the process of rolling out some classroom case courses, basic courses this year. We've run on already, but if you're interested in attending an in-person course, then please contact info@DrayTek.uk, and we'll make sure that you're included in any correspondence when we're making announcements around that. Of course, if you're in the mailing list, then you should receive those as well anyway. But yeah, it's something that we're looking at doing some classroom-based courses now to bring that back, because we have been having some people asking about that.
Okay, another question is, how many admin accounts should we have on the router?
So I guess with that, there's not necessarily any one answer for that. I think it does depend sometimes on the scenario, and how it's being used. I believe if you're using two-factor authentication, then it's quite sensible to have more than one in case of the token being lost. I would also consider using external authentication if there are reasons that you're wanting to have multiple accounts because there's multiple people. As that scales, if you've got 5 or 6 people and 20, 30, 40 routers, then that's where, from a management point of view, external authentication is a real time saver. And also it makes it much easier if someone leaves, because then rather than having to go around to each router and change the settings to disable accounts, you can do it using the central kind of Radius LDAP server. So that's something to consider. But yeah, it's a good idea to, I think, have more than one, from the point of view of if a if credentials get lost. But equally, it's good not to reuse accounts as well sometimes, because if you're using one data, it makes it more difficult from an auditing point of view to identify who's made a change if it just says admin has been the person that logged in. So you get better tracking if you have multiple accounts, but it does vary depending on people's use cases.
Okay, I've got another question. What is the difference between MOTP and TOTP?
Okay, so these are two types of one-time password. MOTP is mobile one-time password, and TOTP, remember, it's time-based one-time password. So TOTP is the one that's used in the Google and Microsoft Authenticator apps, also things like Duo mobile app and other apps. Often you can tell it's a TOTP one because it could have a QR code to do the setup, or you don't need the QR code. You can use the really long string, but it's difficult to remember. So often there's a QR code that you would scan. So that's that one. MOTP is a slightly different but similar mode, but that's used by the Smart VPN client and some other apps. There's generally a PIN code and a secret that you have. So the PIN code is to synchronize the dongle, and then the secret is something that you need to type in to do that. The security, I think, better with TOTP. Because often you'll then have a separate password as well in the setup, but MOTP is also a good one to be using, and it means that you can't reuse the password. So it means that someone can't, I don't know, with a webcam spot what someone's typed in and then be able to reuse the password. So both are good to be using.
Yeah, another question is it good practice to regularly scan the router for vulnerabilities?
So yeah, I think it is a good way to kind of automate detection of things like if there's services are enabled or if there's open ports. It is with routers of limited benefit for kind of detecting if something's out of date from firmware point of view. So I wouldn't say it's a replacement for the best practice when it comes to managing this state and making sure that devices are updated to the latest firmware. One thing is, what we do see is we get a fair number of false positive reports from the various scanners that are online, because the scanners are typically more focused around websites and e-commerce devices, so that's what they're typically more tailored towards. They're not as good with embedded devices, and there are sometimes false positives where they've got the OS or application detection or component detection slightly wrong. So they can sometimes report the router has something that is not a package that it uses. So that can sometimes create false positives that then have to be worked through when it comes to the scanning. But it's a good thing to generally do, but it's not kind of like it's not something where you can just do that and then forget about everything else. I think there's a bunch of things relating to monitoring the settings and doing reviews of the configuration that are really important related to that. But it's a good way of additional catch of things, and sometimes it can detect devices or services that may be enabled by mistake or not logged that they were enabled, that it can report. So it's a good additional technique to be using.
Okay. This question is in regards to ACS3. It says, can Vigo ACS3 disable settings on mass? I think I'll invite Joe to take this one.
Thank you, Doris. So yes, the question is, can Vigo ACS3 disable settings on mass? So for everyone that's on this webinar today, just to give a quick brief summary of what ACS is so everyone is aware of it. Vigo ACS is DrayTek's central management platform for managing all DrayTek devices, whether that be the routers, switches, access points. So these devices are managed using the TR069 management protocol, and every device will have its own configuration options specific to that model. And typically there will be a TR069 parameter mapped to every configuration option on the device. Now that can change with different firmware versions that are on the device. If new firmware versions come out, new features are added, there'll be a specific new entry for a TR069 parameter available, so that configuration can be modified using the Vigor ACS platform. So a really good way to manage all the DrayTek devices. Now, when you are wanting to actually make any changes en masse, as the question here requests, there are some really nice features available on Vigor ACS. So within provisioning, we have the global parameters. This allows us to build a profile. It's kind of like a template which can be modified at a later date as well if the values need to be updated. And these are profiles where we can specify any number of parameters that you want to update on the device. And these parameters can be applied to a single device, multiple devices, or the entire network. All the registered devices within the network can receive these profiles. So it's a very powerful way of ensuring devices get new configuration. And the reporting in the logs of the activity that's applied when the devices register in, they typically register in every 15 minutes and receive any outstanding tasks, such as a global parameter profile. The logs can give information whether the configuration changes that ACS rolled out to the device was successful. And if the device perhaps was on an older firmware and it didn't support that parameter, you will get that information in the logs to understand that there was specific configuration that was not applied. Another bullet point we've got here is about the keep parameters. So ACS can monitor the configuration values on a device. So the previous global parameter that was rolled out, there's an option to set is keep for specific parameters within that profile. And what ACS will do is on events when the device polls into the server, ACS will request what current values are for those specific parameters. So specific parts of the configuration is the firewall still enabled? Potentially that might have been one of the parameters that was applied in the profile. And if the CPU responds with a value that does not match the is keep value, then ACS has the ability then to roll back what the parameters should be on that device, keeping those devices with the correct configuration in place using that keep parameters function. And just to highlight as well, the monitoring and reporting functionality of Vigor ACS. We have the ability to generate reports on Vigor ACS, and these reports can be one-off reports or they can be scheduled at specific times, and the results can be sent via email to specific members within the business as well. And the device configuration report is really quite useful because it gives you a way to monitor key security configuration that might be on the device or any other configuration you're interested in. And the way this is done is by specifying the TR069 parameter that you're interested in and the devices that you want the report to be completed on. So that can be specific devices or an entire network of devices that those parameters are generated from. And the reports will give you an output similar to this, and we can see that if we move on one slide here or move on one action on this, we can see that on the bottom right there's a bit of a red flag here with the fact that we've got an unsecure managed service enabled for Telnet on this device, and the firewall data filter has actually been disabled on this device. So this is a good way of understanding what the status is of your existing estate, and once you've seen the output of this, you could use the global parameter profile to rectify any kind of like security flags that you might have seen. And just to let you know that in terms of the global parameter profiles themselves, there's multiple ways that they can be generated. We've got querying an online device. If you're not familiar with what the parameters are for making changes to certain parts of the device, the querying online device is a nice graphical way of generating the parameters that you need. So it makes it a bit more accessible.
Thank you, Joe. Move on to the next question. Can the login page greeting be used to hide that the device is the DrayTek device? Alex, you take this one.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's superficial, I guess, a little bit, but not really, because what you can kind of replace the DrayTek logo, but most automated systems and scripts, which are the things we kind of need to worry about these days, would still likely identify it from the kind of HTML structure and code. So I wouldn't say it's a way that you could kind of hide it from being a DrayTek. Replacing the certificate is one way that can help to some extent with some scanning, but the best way is to use ACLs and prevent attackers from getting access to the router's web interface.
Okay. Another question is there a way to receive alerts when new firmware is released? This is one of our top common question.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of being on the mailing list. So we have put, there's a link in here to the mailing list, so you should receive options. There's a few different bits of things we do send, but there's one specific that's to do with the firmware, so you can get added to that, and then you'll receive an alert when we release firmware. It's more weekly that we send it, the alerts, but we are looking, because there was another request about if there's some way of getting an RSS feed on the website, so we'll look at that to add that to help with people who can then be notified when every single time we put a change on the site.
Okay. Another question: will auto update? I suppose this is auto firmware updates be supported in the future?
It's something that we're looking at. There's some via GrayTek, some stuff in the works relating to some of this. We're kind of aware that people do want to have control over updating firmwares, because especially if you've got a number of sites and occasionally there can be changes of functionality, and it's important for people to check that the firmware works for them and is all kind of all the different systems they're using work. So that's why the automatic update option is something that generally hasn't been used to give people control over what version's running on their units, but we are looking at adding something relating to this into ACS.
Good. Can we skip firmware updates, or do we need to upgrade to every firmware?
It's a very common question, isn't it, Doris?
Yes.
So it's difficult to give a generic answer to that. The best advice we can give is to look at what firmware version you're currently on and look at the version you want to go to and try and identify how different it is. When it comes to the firmware versions listed on here, for example 4462, that means that can be looked at as major minor patch if we ignore the after the first digit. The 4 indicates DRAOS 4, so the DRAOS 5 products will start with a 5. So the second digit, that second 4, is the major version, and then that third digit is the minor version. And generally smaller changes would be where the minor version stays the same and it's just a patch, so it goes from 446 to 4462 is just a small change. That's compared to if it goes from 4321 to 44, you can see that major version's iterating from 3 to 4, so that's a larger change. It doesn't mean it won't work, but it's just something to be more aware and maybe cautious of. So if there's a site that's 300 miles away, then I would possibly want to check something myself with the same sort of config running on a device that's local or a device in your office. You can check the release notes for any comments, because especially around the first version of each major release. So for example, 4.4.0 would have been the first version of the 4 major release, and then the 4.3.1 would have been the first version of the 3 major release. So if you when it goes from say 4.3.1 up to 4.4.0, it's there that often there might be release note changes, because in the major versions, that's where it's more likely for our engineering to add big bits of functionality or make larger changes. So those release notes might make comments relating to that, and there you can look to see if it's something that's a comment related to things and you're using those features, then that's where it might be something to be more cautious. And also if you've got versions that are many years old, then there might be many major versions you're going through. So you could try jumping one by one, but often what's quite handy is if you do have a unit that's remote, you could take a backup of that config, load it onto a unit locally on the same older firmware version, and then do an upgrade locally with that to see that that's working well for you. So that can give you the confidence that that's going to be a seamless upgrade to do it remotely. I mean, it's just all sounding very cautious, but there are lots of updates that are happening with people skipping versions daily. So it's something that people regularly do, but it's something that you just need to be careful of, because we test older versions to newer versions, but we're not going to test every single version to the latest version. So that's why we focus more around the more recent versions. So when we're releasing 4.4.6.2, we would have checked backwards compatibility with a few of the more recent versions before that, but we're not necessarily would have gone back to like 4.4.0 or something like that. So that's just something to be aware of.
Yes, do agree. Thank you, Alex. Next one, if my network has been compromised, will rebooting the router clear the hack?
So with this, it's, I think, really important to identify what was the source and what is that's going to happen. Why do people think that there's been a hack? So it's all about what's the source of it that will help identify if it's something that is related to the router, and also if rebooting the router would resolve it. Because if it's something that's down to a local PC that's downloaded a virus, then that's not something that's related to the router at all. So it's not going to be a mitigation. When it comes to the router, it's important to look at the settings to make sure nothing's been changed. One of the most common things we've come across historically is people enabling remote management before changing the password or using guessable passwords, and then automatic scripts going in and changing the DNS settings on the routers. It's a very common thing that attackers try and do, because if you change the DNS, then there's other things you can do. You can direct people to fake websites. So one of the key things when it comes to inspection is to check the DNS settings that the router is using to make sure they're ones that are recognized and are known to be. But if there is something where you think there's a compromise, the safest way is to use a RST flash, which would reset the device back to factory defaults. So that's the firmware version, a file that has the .rst file extension. There's two file extensions, .rst and .all. So the .rst file extension resets things to factory defaults. So that completely refreshes the image. And then what you could do is load a backup of a configuration that's already been taken. I wouldn't take a backup of a config, RST, and then reload that config as well, because that config, if it's on a unit that you're not sure about the settings, then you might be. So it's important to take a config that's separate and has been taken previously, that when you had done the maintenance previously. But hopefully that answers that question.
Another question is, how does a hacker detect that I have a DrayTek router, and is there a way I can prevent this?
So the scanning can look at fingerprints of certain responses. For some services, the devices will respond with what operating system they are. That's kind of thing on kind of SSH tends to do that. So the key thing to prevent it is to prevent people from having the ability to communicate with the router's services. So ACL is really helpful related to that, and also disabling services that aren't needed, because then that reduces the number of different services that could be monitored and hacked, and also replacing any auto-generated certificates such as the local certificate. Just on that, I've got a screenshot relating to the certificate management. So if you go onto the router and look at your local services list, it will show you what certificates are being used. And there's a bunch of different local services that use certificates, and there's a default certificate that you can select. Here we've got a router that's using the DrayTek certificate that's a Let's Encrypt one instead of the self-signed certificate. So that would just be a Let's Encrypt certificate that would be shown, and you can see, you can click on all of these links here and change what certificate is used. So the OpenVPN could use a different certificate to the SSL VPN or the 821X, for example. And also in the so if you went into Radius, you can then drop down and select which certificate is used for that. So that's something that's useful to be aware of. So we've got through a lot of those prepared questions, and I can see that you've been throwing, the audience has been throwing a lot of questions at us, which is great. So we'll now be able to, I think, go through some of those questions live. Before that, I just want to just summarize some things on the router best practices. So we will be sharing some more resources relating to this. We'll be sharing checklists and also sharing some documentation that'll help you with some reference guides for this. So you can expect to see those soon. But now I'd like to go on to some live questions. So we'll go through, and I believe we'll be able to kind of answer some of the questions that have come in via the Q&A.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of questions come through. I will pick out some of them, or the ones. So our first question, what is the most secure VPN protocol for both dial-in and LAN-to-LAN VPN?
Okay, so
I suppose we have to consider something that will be, I suppose, compatible with.
there's no, I guess there's no one right answer necessarily, but there are some stronger answers on that. The when it comes to LAN VPN, IKv2 is a really good protocol to use. You have some really strong encryption you can select there, so it's widely seen as secure, and is also quite widely supported by other systems as well. It's only as secure as the configuration, so it does rely on using either a really strong complicated pre-check key, or alternatively using certificates. Using IKv2 with certificates is the best way, because that's more secure than a pre-check key. But that would be, I guess, for dial-in, you'd also, IKv2 would be a really good option. But OpenVPN is good, but there you want to be making sure the certificates are good on that, and selecting the right encryption. So hopefully that answers that. Is there anything else you'd want to add on that, Doris?
No, I think you covered all of it. Yeah. talking about certificates, we have a question on that. So someone asked, how do I go about either purchasing an SSL certificate or self-certifying one? I think I can take this one. So the DrayTek, on the DrayTek router, you have the option to import a third-party signed certificate. By default, it will use a self-signed certificate, but some browsers or systems will complain about that. So you have the option to import a certificate that's been signed by a trusted third party into the router. There are processes involved in you obtaining one, such as you have to generate the certificate request and then submit that to your certificate authority to sign and then import that back into the router. The router, the DrayTek routers now make it easy for you to do that because we support Let's Encrypt. So Let's Encrypt is a certificate authority. So on the DrayTek router, you have the option to generate and assign the certificate through the router's web UI. So that makes it that simplifies the process.
Thank you, Doris. Since you answered one question, I'm going to give you another one now. Then you got another question here that relates to disabling the factory reset button through the control panel. The question is, does that mean that if you lose the admin credentials, the device is then unrecoverable? So if you've disabled the factory reset button, does that mean you are unable to recover a unit if you lose the credentials?
Yeah, this one came up quite a lot by different people. So I assume it's a worry that disabling the reset button, if you're unable to get back through the web GUI, what happens then? So luckily we have a way to reset the router by using the firmware file. So we supply two firmware files. One is to do a firmware update, and that will allow the router to still retain its current configuration. And the other is the two firmware files got different extensions. So the .all file will upgrade the router's firmware and still retain the status on the router, while the RST firmware will upgrade the firmware and factory reset the router. So if you're in, if you find yourself in that state where you can't log into the router and the reset button has been disabled, you can put the router in a TFTP mode. So that the reset button, by pressing the reset button, that still works for putting the router in TFTP mode, and then you can send that firmware RST firmware to the router, and that will factory reset it. So that will allow you to get back into the router.
Okay, thank you very much, Doris. I've now got another question that I'm going to attempt to give to Joelle. It's a question around newsletters. So the question is there a newsletter type notification that we can sign up to get notifications from releases and updates? I don't think Joelle is there, so I'll let Doris. Do you want to answer that one?
Yes, there is on our website. You can should be a mailing list where you can select what options that you want to receive mail notifications for.
Yeah, I'll add the
URL.
Yeah, I'll type it in and type it to the audience, and maybe you can find another question while I'm doing that.
Okay. I suppose this one is to do with the, well, I think we did touch on this on the common questions, did we? It says here, can we all right, this is a question about rebooting the router. So what period of time should I reboot the router? So is that every 30 days or so?
Yeah, so you can schedule that, can't you? There's an ability to schedule a reboot on the router itself in one of the menus.
Yeah, but there isn't any like there isn't any specific timeline for you to do that. But I feel doing it every 30 days or maybe every month or every 2 months should just be fine to keep things running smoothly.
Yeah, I mean we've had I've seen devices that have had multiple years of uptime, and they don't necessarily need to be rebooted. But it's one of those things where there has been guidance released by kind of the kind of security best practices, and so that related to recommendations to reboot routers. So it's something that is kind of sensible to potentially do, because it does clear memory if anyone has managed to find a way of compromising the memory slightly. So that's why the reboot schedules are a sensible idea to do.
Yeah.
Now I see a question about quantum encryption or quantum proof encryption. So the question is about what's the timeline for DrayTek providing encryption methods that are resistant to quantum-based attacks. There's something where I don't at the moment have something published on what the timeline is from DrayTek products. It will vary, I think, from protocol to protocol, because it depends what encryption methods are available for those. So it's something that we'll take away and we'll look up updating people on when it comes to things. It is something that is being looked at, but I don't know to hand what the specific timescale is for updating that on firmware versions.
Okay. I see another question here. Let's see. This is to do with LIGO ACS. It says, does ACS actively pick up device vulnerabilities like a Fortinet security? I suppose this is to do with what ACS does and what it's.
Yes, so the Vigo ACS doesn't specifically report on devices when it comes to vulnerabilities, but what it does do is it will alert you if the units are running older firmware versions. So that's an automatic thing it's doing to highlight if there's a device on an older firmware version. It's also now reporting when there are later firmware versions available as well, so that is helpful. The reporting is quite useful for running regular reports to get information on firmware versions, but there isn't a device level security on it, so it's not looking at the devices that are on the network. However, there are cybersecurity stuff we've got in the pipeline on the roadmap that relates to some stuff around that sort of topic, where the routers would be able to help protect devices on the network and provide additional stuff around reporting on that. So that's something that is I think coming in due course. You do in ACS get some information to do with the devices on the network, but it's not something that I think would be necessarily actionable from a cybersecurity point of view right now, but it's something that we've got in the pipeline, I think, for the future. And related to that is another question about zero trust networks. So this is a concept around a principle where you trust nothing on the network and then allow things case by case. So that's something that we also are, I think, going to be able to announce some stuff on the roadmap in the future. to do with some zero trust networking functions that DrayTek are going to be adding in future models. So there's something where if you're interested around that, then you should be pleased with some of the information that we'll be releasing later once we're ready to share that. So thank you for that question. But I think we're coming up to kind of end of time. So I think we might have time for one more question, Doris, and then we'll, I think, probably move to close.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a question about the net bias on the firewall, net bias filter set up on the firewall on the DrayTek. Someone asked them, I think, what the purpose of that is. So the DrayTek firewall by default is going to allow all outbound traffic except net bias. And we've done that for security reasons. This is to prevent net bias traffic going out to the internet, as attackers can exploit it to gather information about your network, so they can learn about your internal network and resources. So yeah, this is set up to be blocked by default on any DrayTek firewall on our routers. If that answers the question. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Doris. So yeah, we've I think come to time there. So I think we're going to let's move to a wrap up. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I can see we've got one or two extra questions that we'll follow up with directly if we haven't had a chance to cover them. There's quite a lot of questions on here, so I think we've covered most questions, but if there are any that we've missed, what we'll do is we'll kind of email you some stuff back directly. So hopefully that will get any people who've got some questions separately. If you do want to reach out to us and are interested in anything, for example, if you want more information around ViGRA or a ViGRA demo, then please email info@draytek.co.uk. We're very, very happy to set something up for you. You hopefully know our website address on there. But when it comes to the recording, we've recorded this session, so we will be sharing that later with a follow-up email. So you should have an email with a link to it. So if you've got any colleagues who want to watch that, then they'll be able to. Also, the previous webinar that we talked about, that's available online to stream already. So if you look in the video section, you should be able to find that webinar as well. But I think we'll send a follow-up to that link as well in the same follow-up email to that. So thank you everyone for attending. We hope you found it very useful, and do give us feedback on anything more. And if you like this format, if you'd like to do this sort of thing again, because we can do these in addition to our kind of technical webinars running through setup guides. So thank you very much.